Okay, so I've been running my mouth telling you that one of the greatest theories practiced by some of the greatest chefs ever lived is actually wrong. Or at least not the whole truth, if you'll allow me to lessen the potential fall if this dish is complete arse. So to recap, flavour pairing is the idea that foods that share flavour compounds will taste good together. And this was the genius insight of Heston Blumenthal, who uses it as a creative tool and uses it to create mind-blowing dishes like white chocolate and caviar. That idea, practically speaking, works. You can do that. You can analyse foods for the compounds within them and see if any of them overlap and put them together. And you'll probably create something interesting. But the opposite is also true. It's not necessarily the case that you need to have foods that go together to create something interesting. And in fact, in Asian cuisine, ingredients that don't share compounds, that are entirely disparate, also taste good together. Think of ginger and garlic. Well, look, logically, if what a hypothesis predicts is true and false, then the hypothesis is a contradiction and it has to be false. Don't believe me? Well, let's ask my genius and closest friend since moving to the countryside, ChatGPT.
Yes, if a hypothesis is shown to be both true and false, then it is not valid and cannot be accepted as true.
Well, there you have it. Genius AI says no. So apart from what we covered last week, I haven't done any further work on this because I think it's going to be fun to see how a dish can evolve depending on how it tastes as you cook it, and whether you need to add a bit of salt, add a bit of sugar, add some acidity to get the right context for those ingredients. And remember from the first video when we talked about Jacob Collier and how he says there are no two wrong notes. It's just a question of how those notes go together and finding the right context. And the same is true of cooking. Flavors and ingredients can be made to go together. So the challenge. Now, Grant started his flavor bouncing with white beans. They're quite neutral, so a lot of stuff can go with them, but he's started by going with bacon and pork, and for our uses we're going to use a bit of pork fillet and some smoked bacon. And with that he also paired an apple, and he paired the maple syrup, and he paired some almonds. Now the one thing he said wouldn't work is red wine, since that wouldn't go with the maple syrup, and instead he had suggested beer. So our challenge today is to get red wine with these ingredients to work. So I'm going to go over briefly what I said last week and give you the sort of game plan. So now I'm going to crisp up the smoked bacon and the hand-picked breadcrumbs in foaming butter. The problem here that we're going to have, according to this flavour bouncing, is putting red wine and maple syrup together. So our challenge is to find a way to get these two to work. And what I'm thinking to do is to make a gastrique, or kind of like a sweet and sour sauce. So the way that we're going to do that is to take some butter and brown it off a little bit, put in the onions, sweat them down, and then we're going to add the red wine and reduce it. And by cooking the red wine, we change its flavour, and this was covered in the last video. And once we have that, we can then add the maple syrup, we can add a bit of red wine vinegar. I've got some sherry vinegar. And I'm going to put a bit of fenugreek and tarragon in there for reasons which I'll tell you later. And we're also going to finish that with a pork sauce to give it a real body and like a gelatin content so it coats the meat. The pork sauce is nothing out of the ordinary. We've just taken some vegetables, roasted them off, and added water. We've added red wine and some pork bones and roasted pork meat, and some pig trotters as well for body. Cooked it in a pressure cooker for 2 hours and then strained off the resulting liquid and reduced that down to the right consistency. The pork we're just going to cook in a pan very classically with butter, thyme and garlic. So we want to get a nice crust on there, and we're going to develop some of those Maillard flavours that you also find in maple syrup. I might try one thing with the gastrique. I'm going to make two. So one is going to have those ingredients, and then the other is going to have some diced strawberries, which I'm also going to reduce with the onions. Now, when strawberries reduce, you get this incredibly sweet, rich, complex, still slightly floral taste, which I think could work quite well with this. But it wasn't in Grant's original thing, so this is just a fun thing for me. Let's cook. Now that this is reduced a bit, I'm going to add some sherry vinegar and the maple syrup. Now it's important to taste this as you go along to get an idea of where the flavours are and what the sensation is like, and if there's anything that's kind of overpowering, if it's too acidic, if it's too sweet. That's quite interesting. It tastes like a meaty toasted cereal. I'm going to put some fenugreek in there. And I'm just going to let this reduce quite a long way. I've got to say, at this point, this gastrique is already really nice. It's got a really nice back of the throat acidity, whilst a sweetness that blends really well with the onions and the complexity of the wine. And you still get that maple syrup note, like it's obviously maple syrup. But the meatiness of it and those Maillard flavours within it, I think have really blended well. Yeah, and the sauce is really starting to reduce. I'm going to take some of this and add it to the strawberries that we've got reducing as well. So for the fillet, we just want to get some colour with an oil on both sides. So for the fillet, it's important to colour it before you add the butter, so that you get that high temperature. As soon as you add the butter, you're obviously adding moisture, which is going to drop that temperature. Now, a nice thing about cooking over cast iron is that the meat tends to release when you've achieved the correct colouring, like so. So in a Teflon, it obviously never sticks, but you probably get a little line of colouring there. But in here, when you push it down, the whole surface adheres, and then as the crust develops, as the colour develops, then it releases from the pan. So, here is the completed dish. We've got our white beans. They've literally just been tipped out of the tin. What is going on there? So these white beans have been tipped out of the tin with chives and chilli. Added a bit of salt. And we've got our pork fillet. Now this was taken out about an hour before cooking. We seared it off in oil to get the nice colours and the Maillard flavours on the outside. Finished it in foaming butter with garlic and thyme. Now I'm going to cut into it. It's been resting for about 10 minutes. This knife is blunt as fuck. And that's exactly what I was looking for, just a little rosé on the inside. So we'll put these medallions on top. We'll then take the gastrique. And we can spoon this over. That's gone terribly. Now, I'm not being shy with this. This is the main challenge of the dish, is to get this red wine and maple syrup to go together. And so it's important that we get as much of it on there as is reasonable and see how that tastes. The apple, I tried pickling. So I just did it in a normal 3-2-1 pickle. But I think actually the freshness of the apple is enough. I mean, the acidity is sort of there to sort of bring out a bit of freshness and brightness. But when you've already got that in the apple itself, adding anything else seemed a bit lost. So this is just simply raw diced apple. I really hope that works. And this is the crumb. So I've put in the toasted almonds, the toasted breadcrumbs, and the smoked bacon in here. And this will just scatter over the top. And that's it. Okay, so here is the finished dish. Now, I haven't tried this together ever at once, so here's hoping. Here we go. It's pretty fucking good. At the risk of like blowing smoke up my own ass, this is actually a really nice bowl of food. The texture of the bacon and the breadcrumbs really works with a bit of smokiness and saltiness that you get from that. The gastrique itself is just so rich, and that acidic that really just gets the back with the sweetness as well that kind of tempers it. And you get those maple notes. So I've got the fenugreek, got the tarragon and the maple syrup itself as well, and you saw how much I added of that. And that's bringing all the sweetness to this. The white beans are creamy and delicious, and I mean, they're spoonable by themselves. They're bloody great beans, but you know, in this, they've really come through as well. And the chili, they're not, I mean, they were just like bog standard chilies from your supermarket. I don't even know what kind they were, but they've got a little bit of a heat, and that comes through at the end, which is really pleasant. The chives as well, a nice herb note, a nice sort of onion note to complement the more savoury reduced onions. My only thing I would say is the one with strawberries in is actually nicer. So we've made the gastrique as normal, and then I added strawberries to half of it halfway through and cooked that down. And the sweetness in that is almost deeper, as well as the acidity. So, I mean, I've used red wine vinegar essentially for this, and that's primarily acetic acid. Whereas in strawberries, you've got other acids in there. And you've got fructose, which is the sugar that is in fruit. And so you've got these two kinds of sweetness and kind of two kinds of acidity. And it's just a bit more rounded and a bit more, it's kind of hard to put into words, but there's just more, I'm going to say complexity. There's more complexity in the one with strawberries in. And yeah, this has really worked. But you can't just take my word for it. Now that was all the usable footage I got out of Phyllis being involved, and then she pissed at the bottom of the stairs. It's the last time I used her. Now that was a lot of fun, and I hope you took some information and learned a few things from that as well. These ingredients that we're told weren't meant to go together, like maple syrup and red wine, we looked into and we understood what is in them so that we might be able to sort of adjust their levels such that they go well together, and to put them in the right context so the flavours make sense. And I tried to do it in as simple a way as possible. I mean, all we did to these things, we didn't really change them, we didn't do anything out of the ordinary, we literally just applied a gentle heat which reduced it. And that was enough to change the context of those flavours to make them taste good. Yeah, and that was significantly different, of course, to having like red wine out of the bottle and maple syrup out of the bottle. That wouldn't be so pleasant, but that's not what we do as cooks, that we're always looking at how we can change ingredients and to manipulate them to create flavour and to create the right context for the flavour. And by showing you the simplest, I just want to show you how much more could be possible. We've only just scratched the surface. Well, in fact, we've not even done that really. We've just boiled a liquid. But all these other techniques that we can be looking into in the future. So like aging meats, we can look into fermentation, making misos, into smoking, cooking over charcoal. There's so much, and I'm really excited to start looking into these. And if this is the kind of content that you think you'll enjoy or that you'll find useful, then please do think about liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and clicking the bell. Thank you, see you next time.